Welcome everyone to this webinar. Very glad that so many could join today. We have unfortunately had a little setback. Ulf Herbig from Kneipp has had an unexpected delay. I hope he might join during the webinar to take part in the presentation. And if he doesn't, we have a second session planned also this afternoon to which he should be able to attend. So I will do my best to cover what he was meant to say during this presentation, and we will hope that he is able to join. I'm going to pull up the presentation now, and we can start. Here we go. So the presentation is available also under the handouts you should have it on the sidebar, the handouts, as well as a presentation of GRC Watch services. All right. So here are the slides. Our topic today is to talk about the EMT 3.0 new template that the FinDatEx has created, as well as in the second session talking about the new EFT, so the feedback template that is currently being sent out for feedback from the FinDatEx. So it's still in draft form, and we will be talking about that in the second session. So today we'll be covering a little bit what the EMT is and what it's used for, where the industry is at. We'll have a live poll here to ask some questions about where you are in the upgrade. We will also be talking about what to watch out for in the upgrade, what the changes are, and how to make the EMT available in the best possible way. So the EMT is by the FinDatEx initiative. So the FinDatEx has had a working group to create this template. So you have representatives from lots of different industry groups and big players in the industry who have taken part in this. So the initial version, the 1.0, was launched and has had a huge success in the market as the preferred way for reporting EMT data, so MiFID II related data. It aims to be inclusive, open and transparent to all European financial service representatives. And the templates are not compulsory and are provided free of charge and free of any intellectual property rights, so they can be integrated in different processes in a good way. Even though they're not compulsory, they have gained a huge importance in the market, which we'll be getting to a little bit later on. So this is really an idea to support standardization and technical templates and to improve the exchange of data surrounding the MiFID II regulations from the FinDatEx. So a lot of hours have gone into creating these templates that are now very widely used. Then we also have the question of the implementation timeline. So the EMT1 is going to be valid up until the 10th of December. There was a transition period from the 10th of December 2019 to the 10th of December 2020. The EMT3 will, after that period, be the standard. And the big question here is, how ready is the market? Will there still be players who will be willing to accept the EMT post that deadline? Or will there be do we have someone else? Ulf, is that you? Ulf, we can.
Good morning.
Good morning. I'm sorry I started while I was waiting for you to come.
Absolutely. Thank you. So sorry, I was working on the EMT4. In fact, thank you. So welcome and good morning, everyone. Sorry for being late. There were some technical problems for some reason. So I'm Ulf Herbig. I'm the head of product.
And we lost Ulf again. I don't know why. Here we go. Ulf is back. No. A quick appearance. Well, I'll continue while Ulf is sorting out his technical issues. So like I was saying, that there are many questions surrounding now the 10th of December is basically in a month. So there are some questions here about, how ready is the market? Will we be able to implement it from that deadline that has been set? Will the transition period continue a little bit under the radar? So what is the situation post deadline 10th of December? So I will move on to the next slide, and Ulf can come back to these if he wants to. Ulf, as soon as you've sorted your technical issues, just kind of butt in.
I'm here.
You there? All right. Okay, great.
Yes, I'm here. So I hope finally we sorted it. Apologies again.
No worries. So Ulf actually was a member of the FinDatEx working group. So he has been working actively on all of the EMT templates, and as you heard, is actually currently working on the EMT4 as well. We have some questions about the EMT4, which we will be answering.
Exactly. So I've been hands-on on working on the EMT. That's why we're happy to present to you what was the outcome of all the work of this working group at the FinDatEx.
So I might have rushed past the slides regarding the FinDatEx. Do you want to comment a little bit? I can go back here.
I think generally you've probably covered everything. Most importantly, it's an industry-neutral body that has been formed out of Insurance Europe, European Banking Association, and EFAMA. Therefore, it's great to see also the acceptance back in the days from the EPT and the EMT now with its revised version even, and later in the other webinar we'll even be talking about the EFT. So therefore, I think it's a great achievement of the industry having formed such a body.
Absolutely. And I spoke a little bit about the timeline here and posed the question, there's something that we'll be looking at in this webinar is whether, the industry is ready for the deadline. Would you like to say some words on this slide as well?
I think generally, I guess we'll be also having a poll later on. Most importantly, I guess it's to recognize this is not a regulatory deadline. It's a recommended deadline set out by the FinDatEx because there was a survey made back in 2019. What is probably the timeline that the industry needs in order to adapt? From the feedback we have from the market, it seems a bit like when you prepare for an exam in studies, the closer you get to the deadline, the more people start to rush. And the feedback we had in the EFAMA webinar we did 2 weeks ago was that also there is a bit of a quarter of the market that tends to be ready only by end of the year, beginning of Q1. Again, I think ultimately it is the demand that drives the upgrade, which means that the more distributors will be asking, the more you will be pushed in order to upgrade to the EMTv3.
Yeah, absolutely. So every fund manufacturer will be impacted, and like Ulf is saying, even though it's not a regulatory obligation to provide the EMT, it is become a necessary part of the distribution of funds. So, I mean, the EMT provides distributors with the data they need to ensure that they are compliant with their regulatory obligations. So, not having the MiFID data available means that there might be issues in your distribution channels. So you might have distributors who choose not to deselect your funds because they cannot retrieve the data they need for their reporting obligations. So it's important that fund manufacturers start providing the new EMT to their distributors, and like we said in the transition period, there might even be a need to be able to handle both versions in parallel during a time. So are fund manufacturers ready to produce the EMT? So actually we found when talking to members in the GRC Watch network that many fund managers are still producing the EMT in-house, upgrading the EMT 3.0 will therefore require an allocation of resources to make that happen, of course. So when asking asset managers, we found that about a third actually had not started to upgrade yet. One of those reasons is, like Ulf was saying, some might not have a need to do it before the complete end of year or during Q1. So that could be an explanation to why. Of those who had started, only 30% have finished the process. And kind of interesting, out of those, 2 out of 3 felt it had been a smooth process. So we can see that there are companies who managed to implement this in a smooth way, but there are some who are struggling as well. So from this, we conclude that asset managers, they are ready for the upgrade, but some of them have chosen to, or are not able to meet the deadline in December. So I think we're ready to kind of move on to the live poll here, because we're very curious to understand where our audience is at. So I will be launching some questions here, and maybe while I'm launching the questions and we're waiting for the results to come in, Ulf, you could tell us a little bit about the experience that you have from live polls and webinars you did earlier this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Susanna. We did a very first one in January already, when we did an Alfie breakfast in Luxembourg, and it was very clear to see that the vast majority of firms back in the days hadn't started to work on the EMT. And what we then saw when we had the first IFAMA webinar in March, we saw that it had kind of started to kick off, that people started work on the EMT. But what then obviously came across the whole globe was the global pandemic. And the global pandemic has probably led to the point that people have, obviously for obvious reason, lost the focus and the reasoning to work on the EMT upgrade, because I guess most of us had more important things to do and to think else than working on the EMT upgrade. Nonetheless, I think the one that we did just 2 weeks ago has shown that just half a year later, exactly that picture of only 25% had either started or planned to work on the EMT upgrade has completely turned around, so that we have exactly that situation, that now the vast majority of the market has either already completed or started the upgrade of the EMT v3, which is great. I think for those firms who haven't started, it's probably due to the demand or the not existing demand or requests from their distributors yet. But we would clearly expect this to arise, and obviously not being ready risk at any time, that if you are not ready and you have a distributor who gives you a hard deadline to provide a new version of the EMT v3, you rather put your distribution chain at risk.
Absolutely. So the poll is live. We're getting in some answers here. Don't be shy. Feel free to participate. You can see it there's a chat panel that should be on your screen, normally to the right. And the polls is a tab under that chat panel, which says polls. So we've gotten in 7 answers so far. So the poll will remain open throughout the webinar if you'd rather reply now, and it will even be open for a few hours after the webinar if you're interested in participating. But what we can see so far is that out of 7 responses, 5 have already started actively working on the EMT upgrade. Now 8 responses on that question, so 3 haven't. There's over 50% in the audience who actually have started on the upgrade. And similar numbers actually on question 2, have you been asked by the market to provide the EMT version 3.1? So interesting to see that there is a demand from distributors, because of course for distributors to be able to utilize the EMT, there needs to be a match between the versions, right? So if you have distributors who have updated their capacity or capabilities of receiving the EMT and have updated it to receiving an EMT3, they won't be able to process and handle the EMT version 1. necessarily. Some of them are also putting in place, the capabilities of receiving both versions and working with both versions, but others have not. So that's also a market demand. When do you plan to be EMT ready? So here we have a bit of a more split number. So by the end of the transition period, 43%. By Q1 2021 to 29%, almost 30%. So Ulf will probably be touching upon that. Why there some firms are choosing to not meet the deadline. And another 29% are actually ready and live with EMT3. So well done to you. With regard to the what the biggest challenges have been, it seems to be kind of a split between the resources for the upgrade, which of course when you're doing it in-house is time consuming and resource consuming, and managing the EMT in parallel. So of course that is two documents to keep updated, two formats to maintain. And actually, interesting, nobody finds it a challenge to have the different EMT formats, Excel, SV, SS, CSV, or open funds. So that's really quite interesting. And then the last one, what risks do you foresee in the context of the EMT3? Inconsistent target market is something that is a top concern apparently, and unplanned costs for the implementation, again, really a resource issue. So interesting to see these results. Like I said, the poll will remain open, so feel free to participate after the webinar if you like. Ulf, would you like to make any comment here?
I think the answers or the statistics are not really surprising and kind of matching what we saw previously. I think the webinar also is designed to help particularly the firms who have either completed and are now ready to distribute their EMTs, but also to the firms who have not yet either started or completed and struggle to get it upgraded. And we hope to give everyone a bit food for thought and to take something out of the webinar.
Yeah. And Ulf, just in the chat, we have a request if you could mute while I'm speaking. Apparently there's some sound that goes around. If you could do that, that would be great.
Sure.
But I think we will be speaking for a bit now, so I will be sure to mute. We can then move on to the next slide. Are distributors and data vendors ready to receive the EMT 3.0? So Ulf, with your experience and your relationship with the data vendors, what are you seeing on the market today?
What we clearly see is, I think, that data vendors are more advanced typically than the distributors. And for those that we have been speaking with and where we are delivering data on behalf of our customers too, when we go to the next slide, we can clearly see that the readiness is nearly complete on the data vendor side. So there is really data vendors who are today not in the position of receiving the EMT v3. When it comes to distributors, as this market is obviously much more widespread, I think it really depends on how big is the distribution network of a distributor. But nonetheless, we clearly see the number increasing of the requests that distributors nowadays send to their manufacturer whose funds they sell, because obviously there was a reason why the EMT3 was designed. It was designed to help and further provide information with more fine-grained data to the distributor in order to, for example, allow to produce an ex-post cost reporting for the end investor. Absolutely. I think the core of the question now is, however, are you aware of any position of your distribution network? Because the core of the question is ultimately what is going to happen beyond December 10th. I mentioned to you that it's not a regulatory deadline, it's a recommended. But this being said, we clearly see that there is two extremes. So if we look at the next slide, you will see there is the extreme of the hardliner on those firms who very likely due to technical constraints may say, when we basically upgrade our reception to EMT v3, we must stop the reception of the EMT v1, which ultimately means firms who are not ready with the EMT v3 will struggle to get their data to this distributor or this data vendor, simply because they will no longer technically be able to process the EMT version v1. And then there is obviously the other extreme of the firms, and I would even consider ourselves to this. We obviously want at no point at all a service interruption for our customers, and therefore we generally have that open mind to say, as long as someone needs an EMT v1, we will enable the customer to produce the v1 and the v3 and to send the v1 and the v3. Now, from the polls, we clearly see that this should come to an end somewhere in Q1. But again, the most important is the question you have to ask yourself: do you know the view of your distribution network? Is there a hardliner that basically forces you to be ready with the EMT v3 at a given point in time? May this be December 11th.
All right. Yeah, so I just wanted to give a brief refresher of what the EMT is and what it contains. Basically, there are 4 main sections, and in the version 3.0, you see there has been a new section that's been added in gray on this slide, which Ulf will be talking about a little bit later. But just kind of a brief reminder of what the EMT actually contains. So there's general information to identify the product, so we know what product we're talking about. The target market, so to describe to whom the product can be sold. The ex-ante cost, so indicative cost to inform investors before buying the product what the cost might be. And then the ex-post cost, of course, the actual cost to inform investors what the products did actually cost. So, I mean, these are very important in the kind of distribution network, the distribution chain, that this information can flow smoothly from the fund manufacturer to the distributor and to the end investor. So that's really the kind of goal for standardizing this process in the EMT. Moving on to the next slide, we have, why do you need to have some special attention when upgrading to the EMT 3.0? So these differences will need to be reviewed. The differences between the 2 templates need to be reviewed and understood. They can have a significant impact on the quantity and the quality of the MiFID data being disseminated to your distribution network or data vendors. So based on the EMT update, the specifically fields relating to the target market and the distribution strategy have been changed. So a manufacturer who had a full data set for one product, for example, under EMT1, might find that this data set is no longer valid or complete when translating it over into the EMT 3.0. So you need to really ensure that the product categories haven't been impacted and pay special attention to that. And I think, Ulf will be telling you a little bit more now about the actual changes.
Yeah, thanks, Susanna. So we called it actually the target market pitfall, and indeed it is kind of a pitfall, simply because we have been observing around 62,000 ISIN, and we found out that around a quarter of the asset managers is impacted for fields that are actually not really changing in a sense of that they exist in the V1 and the V3. But what happens is that there is values of these fields which are allowed in the version 1, but are no longer allowed in the version 3. And what we saw is that for these fields, and it's 5 of these fields, I'm coming to which of them particularly on the next slide, but before, we saw that 25% of the asset managers are impacted, and when you are impacted, it's actually 40% of your scope on average that is impacted. Now, having a closer look at what these typical fields are, that you, especially when you upgrade to V3, may want to have a closer look. And these fields are the product category Germany. And what has changed, and it was apparently even part of the Q&A from the version 1, that you should be using the product categories with the values from 1 to 22. Now, some firms have used other values such as the XL codes in Germany, but some other firms simply have written text in it. Now this won't be allowed anymore under the version 3. And due to that, you may want to simply revise in particular that field and when you're distributing in Germany. The other field that we saw, which in 12% of the cases had been impacted, is the field for the other specific investment need, where the neutral has been removed, and that yet again is something you may want to pay attention to. And what we also offer to anyone in the market is a simple EMT V1, V3 comparison and version check, so that you can literally just upload your EMT on our website, and within a few hours you get back the feedback to what extent the values you have in the V1 for the fields that coexist in the version 3 are either impacted by this pitfall or are not. So when we move on, then obviously, especially those firms, I guess, who have not yet started or on the process of upgrading, obviously want to understand what has changed. And when we look at the changes of the EMT v3, Susanna has already touched on one. There is a new section, which is this general information section that has particularly been designed now to respond to one of the complaints from the market, where the market was saying, well, you know, for example, for a new launched fund, there won't be any ex post cost, and there is this famous 99.99 that firms had to populate in the version 1, and depending on the technical capabilities of the recipient, this has worked or it has unfortunately not worked. And this new section now allows every firm to actually disclose whether you populate or you do not populate a particular section, which then technically, for example, for the ex post cost section, you say this is a no, then no matter whether there is fields in this section that are classified as mandatory or not, this specification no longer applies, simply because at the beginning you say that you will not populate that section. Then there is something challenging, I guess, at least it's a minor detail. There have been name changes to existing fields, which means that generally these fields coexist from one version to the other, but the name has changed. And one of the prominent examples where it wasn't kind of we change a capital letter to a lowercase letter type of thingy, which would rather be the easy bit, is probably the time horizon, where the time horizon is now called minimum recommended holding period. And these are changes that simply reflect that you should be paying attention field by field by field, whether the field exists, has changed its name, or has even changed the requirement, which brings me to the next point, because there have been changes in requirements. Some fields have become mandatory now, whilst they were optional before. And all of this, as a side note, is summarized and available also on the FinDatEx website. So when you go on findatex.eu, there is the official specification of the EMTv3, but there is an additional document available for download, which is the comparison, the official comparison between the version 1 and particularly on, it is very important that you understand that some of these new fields are actually therefore you may consider these fields as mandatory depending on whether you distribute in these countries or not. And last but not least, yes.
We seem to be hearing you a little bit every other word. Some more unfortunate technical issues on Ulf's side here. I will see if I can wrap this up. Ulf really is the expert, since among his many competences and talents, he actually was in these working groups, which is why his presence here is so appreciated. But yeah, the last question, the last area here is the allowed values change on existing fields. So, this can impact a field where you may have already input information. If that allowed value is no longer an allowed value, then that is something, of course, that will create a mismatch in the data, and your EMT will fail or not have the sufficient data. I will move on. So with regard to the new fields, there are some things to note here. So the version of the EMT going forward is structured now and sets in a way so that firms can easily disclose which version they are reporting. This is not really applicable between the versions 1 and the versions 3 due to differences in the field names and the scope of fields, but it can surely be applicable if we'd ever have a version, or we will have a version 4 in the future. So static information to identify the producer of the document, the lay, and the email, as well as the name, have been added. And for the manufacturer, the lay and email address of optional fields to enable distributor feedback reporting has also been included. So there are a number of fields here that where there have been changes. I think that as many of you already have implemented it, I think we don't need to go through them field by field. There are some fields that have been added to isolate ESG preferences. So I think that's important to note. ESG is a very hot topic. And other fields where ESG options have been removed. So this is definitely something to keep a close eye on. And then in regard to the cost and the ex-ante cost section, there's a new field to enable a modular approach to the ex-ante cost and charges that could be referenced using the date, irrespective of data in other sections. So this is really quite interesting because the costs have maybe a different reporting timeline or aren't necessarily updated in the same degree. So I know that in the version 3.0, there's the possibility to update just a certain section or field with a kind of date marker there. So you don't necessarily need to update the full document, and it allows for the identification of changes without having to replace the whole data set when receiving the EMT. Are you back online, Ulf?
Yeah, I now finally use the phone. I mean, back to the 1990s. This Wi-Fi plays tricks on me, or has decided to already be on the weekend. Apologies to everyone for that.
No worries. Is there anything I missed? I don't know if you were able to hear me. Is there anything I missed when talking about the new fields?
No, I think really for the new fields particularly, it is a bit tricky for those that are considered as optional, particularly because you need to look at the ones where they are linked to a particular country like Italy and the UK, to really be clear, the distributors in these countries would consider them as mandatory. And I think not sure you haven't mentioned that the fields regarding the reporting date or the section date for most, that now with the version 3, everyone is in the position to actually disclose which section they updated. So there is the general reporting date in the top section of the EMT, but every individual section has a date field as well, which responds and is a reaction to complaints from the market that when they were receiving in the past the version 1, they could not really allocate where the change did actually happen and where no change did happen. And what you would now simply be able to do is you may have a new reporting date in the top section, but let's assume you only update your target market. You would only update the date field in the target market section on top, but not change the date field in the ex-ante or the ex-post cost section. And that really allows the recipient of the EMT to understand much better and quicker where do I have to pay special attention.
A much more complete insight than what I was able to give before you rejoined. Thank you very much, Ulf. So moving on here, how ready are you with the EMT 3.0? So this is more for those who are still in the process of updating. So we've just included in the presentation here a checklist of things to think of if you're still in the process of updating. So Ulf, from your experience, what have the biggest challenges been for asset managers when updating, if you look at this, and maybe even from a distributor perspective? I'm not sure that's relevant here, but also for receiving the EMT and having capability to get the data from the new fields. What do you see are the biggest challenges from the checklist?
I would say generally understanding what the changes are. So although there is this translation document that I mentioned, which is available on the FinDatEx website, obviously sometimes firms find it hard to still understand what the changes mean, where there is a new field introduced and how I would populate that. And it's particularly questions on individual fields. And certainly depending on how the firms have chosen their setup, may this be a production with a service provider and no longer manage this in Excel, or only the dissemination, or they manage everything themselves, they may face complete different problems, obviously. Because if I look at what we have done, on the click of a button, you can generate EMT v3 drafts out of a valid EMT v1. If you now have a situation where you basically work in Excel, then what you as a firm will probably need to do is you need to create in Excel your own conversion from v1 to v3. But that's not the end of the story, because no matter how complete and how good you produce your EMT, at the end of the day, what matters also is how the recipient wants to receive that EMT, either version 1 or version 3, because this may either change in the way of transmission, may this be email or FTP or even upload, as well as that some other firms as recipient choose to say, we want it in XLS, we wanted it in XLSX, and CSV, and TXT, and open funds, and funds library format, just to name a few, and to outline a bit the complexity. And in order to keep your operations lean and as efficient as possible, it's obviously very helpful to have any sort of technology in place that supports on the one hand, the production of the same ISIN in both versions at the same time. On the other hand, to leverage the data you already have and spend a lot of time probably in the past producing the V1 to automatically generate V3s. And on the other hand, to keep oversight of which version did you send when to whom, and to ultimately be able to respond to any distributor requests or data vendor requests who may say, but I do not believe the data that you sent me. And if you are then not clear about what data was ultimately sent, then all of this kind of question and answers and interaction with the distributor or the data vendor can get quite tricky.
Yeah, and interesting there about the dissemination. We've actually been we've gotten a few requests or queries from both asset managers and distributors actually, if it's possible to upload EMT into the GRC Watch platform, simply because it's easier to keep track of what was uploaded there, published there, versus what did I send in an email. So that is also, so we can see that there is interest to find a way to keep track of what has been sent when and which version is the latest. So interesting note. We have just a few.
And I would really support that, right? I think this would yet unlock another potential of the GRC Watch platform, because it makes it much more efficient for everyone to exchange MiFID data.
Absolutely, and we hope there's more to come on that in the future. But right now, it's a simple file upload, if that is an option. Yeah, we have just a few minutes left before we're taking a 15-minute break, during which we hope to sort our technical difficulties here, and then start on the second session, which is dedicated to the EFT. But before we do, we actually have a few questions and answers that came in ahead of this this webinar. If you have any questions and answers, please write them in the question and answers tab under the chat. and we'll try and get to them or possibly answer them after the webinar. But Ulf, the questions that we received ahead of time here, I thought I'd read them up and then maybe you could give the answers. So the first question is there a specified definition of what is meant by structured securities?
Yeah, I think structured securities is everything that relates to structured products, and it does not relate to funds. For this particular reason, there has been the classification structured funds. So that you will find 3 different classifications in the EMT, which is funds, structured funds, and structured securities. And structured securities, just to give an example, would be certificates, for example.
Okay, great. And another question we received is, will there be a new version to adapt to regulation EU 219/2088?
In regards to a new version, what is the latest news from the FinDatEx is that the particular work on an ESG template has been put on hold due to the delay on the SFDR level 2. What has carried out more is the ambition to recommend a different interpretation of the existing ESG field in the V3. So I would not expect a version 4 coming out soon of the EMT, and I think ultimately the market is rather happy about not being required to adapt to a version 4 so soon.
Okay, and I think we have time for one last question here, and I think this is a very interesting one. So the question is, the X cost information is needed once a year. Would it be needed to complete it every time a fund manager sends an updated version of the EMT3, or could it be empty?
It's a great question, and I think it relates to what I was saying earlier regarding the date fields. I think there is no particular reason why you would leave that section empty when your fund is old enough and you already had disclosed ex post cost information, because due to this new date field, you can simply always keep the date range and the date of this section similar, so that the recipient understands there isn't actually an update of the ex post cost, because you may want to just disclose and inform about an update of the ex ante or of the target market section.
Okay, great. Well, I think that actually concludes this session. Despite technical difficulties, just 1 minute over time. The idea now is that we take a 15-minute break, and for those who are interested, we have a second session that starts at 10 o'clock regarding the EFT template that's currently out for consultation. So the FinDatEx has provided a draft template, which is out for consultation, that will be implemented with the idea to help distributors perform their feedback reporting on MiFID data to asset managers. So that will be a file that goes in the reverse sense from distributors to asset managers. And I think will be an exciting addition to the standardization in the market. So please join us for that second session. If you haven't already registered, you can do it through the same link as for this webinar. And yeah, I hope to see many of you again back on the second session. So thank you so much for joining. Huge apologies for the technical difficulties that we encountered. Thank you for your patience there, and hope to see you very soon.
Thank you, everyone, and apologies from my side primarily.